Alicia Brown, a black woman, faces blatant racism when the owner of a local steakhouse, Timothy Carter, denies her service, spewing offensive remarks and invoking racial stereotypes. His explosive outbursts escalate, even targeting peaceful protesters who demand accountability. The story delves into the systemic discrimination Alicia confronts, exposing Timothy's history of prejudice and his unwillingness to accept responsibility. As testimonies and video evidence bring his actions to light, the trial becomes a gripping fight for justice, reflecting the infuriating realities of racism and the courage required to stand against it. Here is the story. On a breezy summer afternoon, Dana Hill walked confidently into Harper's Bistro, a quaint restaurant known for its charming rustic decor and dimly lit ambiance. She adjusted her sunglasses and surveyed the room, her sharp gaze taking in the half-empty tables and the subtle hum of conversation. At the host stand, a man with graying temples and a neatly pressed polo shirt stood, his name tag reading Gerald Sims. His posture exuded an air of authority, though his eyes narrowed as they locked onto Dana. Gerald's lips curved into a tight smile as she approached, but the tension behind it was unmistakable. "Afternoon, ma'am, table for one?" he asked, his tone flat but with an undertone that felt off. "Yes, please," Dana replied, her voice warm but assertive. Gerald glanced over his shoulder at the dining area, where several open tables were neatly set with crisp white linens. He hesitated, then flipped through the reservations book with exaggerated care. "Sorry, we're fully booked today," he said with a dismissive shrug, avoiding her eyes. Dana's brows lifted slightly as she glanced past him. "Fully booked?" she repeated, her voice calm but laced with skepticism. "There are at least 5 empty tables. Surely you can fit me in." Gerald's polite facade cracked just a little as he leaned on the podium, crossing his arms. "Those are reserved," he said curtly, his gaze now cold and challenging. Dana tilted her head slightly, holding his gaze. "Reservations that don't seem to have arrived yet. I won't take long. I'm only here for a quick lunch." Gerald let out a humorless chuckle and straightened up, his demeanor shifting from polite to overtly condescending. "Look, this isn't the kind of place for casual dining. Maybe there's a diner down the road that'd suit you better." The room's ambiance changed almost imperceptibly, a hush falling over nearby tables as diners subtly tuned in. Dana's jaw tightened, but she refused to show any sign of backing down. "Excuse me?" she said, her voice low and deliberate. Gerald smirked and waved his hand dismissively. "You heard me. We try to keep a certain atmosphere here. No offense, but you might be more comfortable somewhere else." Dana's posture remained steady, though her pulse quickened. "So you're telling me I'm not welcome here," she said, her tone cutting through the air like a blade. "And I'd like to hear exactly why." Gerald's smirk twisted into something uglier. "Don't make this a thing," he muttered, his voice dropping to a near growl. "We reserve the right to refuse service. I don't owe you an explanation." Dana's lips curved into a cool smile. "Actually, as someone running a public establishment, you do owe me an explanation if you're refusing me service for reasons that violate anti-discrimination laws." Gerald's face flushed, the confidence he wore like armor cracking just slightly under the weight of her unwavering gaze. "Why don't you just leave before this gets ugly?" he spat, glancing around as if daring anyone to intervene. A few tables over, a young couple exchanged uneasy glances. The woman reached for her partner's hand, whispering something under her breath. Another patron, an elderly man with a cane resting against his chair, frowned and shifted uncomfortably. Dana took a deep breath, her voice steady as she pulled her phone from her bag and held it up. "Care to repeat that for the record?" Gerald's eyes darted to the phone, his bravado faltering. "What are you doing?" he snapped. "Documenting," Dana replied simply, hitting the record button, "just in case anyone needs clarification on why you're refusing to serve me." The tension in the room thickened. Gerald's fingers twitched as though he wanted to snatch the phone from her hand, but he instead sneered. "You're playing the victim. That's all you people ever do. Go ahead, post your little video. No one cares." Gasps rippled through the room. One of the waitstaff froze mid-step, the tray in her hands wobbling dangerously before she steadied it. Dana's expression didn't change, but her eyes narrowed. "So you're making this about race," she said, her voice deadly calm. Gerald's smirk faded for a moment before returning, now tinged with anger. "Don't twist my words," he snarled. "I'm just saying, people like you always cause trouble. That's why you don't belong here." Dana lowered her phone slightly, her expression hardening. "You've made your stance very clear," she said. "And now I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly who you are." Gerald barked a humorless laugh, pointing toward the door. "You think you can scare me? Get out before I have to call the cops." Dana tilted her head, her gaze unflinching. "Go ahead, call them," she said coolly. "Let's see how they feel about someone using law enforcement to enforce bigotry." The restaurant fell into a strained silence, the weight of Dana's words sinking in. Gerald hesitated, glancing toward the windows where a few passers-by had stopped to peer in, curiosity etched across their faces. A flicker of doubt crossed his face, but he quickly masked it with anger. "Fine," he snapped. grabbing the phone from the podium and dialing. Let's see how much trouble you're willing to cause. Dana kept her phone raised, recording every second. As Gerald barked into the receiver about a disruptive customer, she turned slightly, catching the uneasy expressions of the diners and the staff. A young waiter lingered near the kitchen door, his face pale as he exchanged a glance with an older waitress who shook her head, her expression grim. When Gerald slammed the phone down, he turned to Dana, his smirk returning as the faint sound of sirens grew in the distance. Let's see how confident you are when the cops get here, he said smugly. Dana didn't flinch. She met his gaze, her voice steady. I'm not afraid of the truth. Are you? As the heated exchange outside Carter's steakhouse escalated, Timothy Carter's voice echoed through the streets, fueled by frustration and defiance. His red hat gleamed in the sun, a beacon of his stubborn pride. You think you can destroy me with your little signs and chants? He bellowed, pacing like a caged animal before the growing crowd. His words were harsh, filled with contempt. You don't know what it takes to run a business, to build something from the ground up. You people just want to tear it all down. The crowd's chants rose louder in response. Signs waved high above heads, bearing phrases like equality for all and justice for Alicia. Protesters' voices harmonized in a unified cry for accountability. Near the front, a young man held his phone steady, recording Timothy's tirade. His calm demeanor contrasted starkly with Timothy's unhinged outburst. The world's watching, the young man said evenly, his eyes locked on Timothy. Keep talking. Timothy's hand twitched, his fingers curling into a fist. He took a menacing step forward. Turn that off, he snarled. You have no right to stand here and make a spectacle of me. The young man didn't flinch, his voice steady. You're doing that all on your own, Mr. Carter. A middle-aged woman in the crowd stepped in, placing herself protectively between Timothy and the young man. Her face was set with determination, her voice calm but unwavering. Back off, she said firmly. This is bigger than you and your restaurant. This is about justice. Timothy sneered, his anger bubbling over. Justice. You don't know the first thing about justice. I built this place with my own 2 hands. I've worked day and night to make it what it is. And now, because of one woman and her lies, you're all trying to ruin me. The crowd responded with boos and chants of shut it down. Timothy's words seemed only to ignite their resolve. Margaret appeared in the doorway, her face pale and etched with worry. Tim, she pleaded, her voice barely audible over the din. Please come back inside. This isn't helping. Timothy whirled around to face her, his face contorted with rage. Helping? Do you think rolling over and letting them trample all over me is going to help? They're vultures, Margaret, vultures. Margaret's shoulders sagged as she stepped back, her expression a mix of exhaustion and resignation. You're only making things worse, she said quietly, retreating into the shadows of the restaurant. Back in the crowd, Alicia stood tall, her phone capturing every moment. Her calm exterior masked the adrenaline coursing through her veins, but her resolve was unwavering. She stepped closer to the front, her presence drawing the attention of the protesters. Mr. Carter, she called out, her voice cutting through the chaos. The crowd quieted slightly as all eyes turned to her. This isn't just about me. It's about every person you've dismissed, belittled, and excluded. You thought you could get away with it because no one would challenge you. But look around, she gestured to the crowd. You can't ignore us anymore. Timothy's face darkened, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for a retort. Before he could respond, the sound of police sirens filled the air. The crowd parted slightly as 2 patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing. 2 officers stepped out, their expressions neutral but wary as they approached Timothy. One of them, a tall man with a calm demeanor, raised a hand. Mr. Carter, he said firmly, we've received multiple complaints about this situation. We need you to step back and let us handle this. Timothy's bravado faltered, but he crossed his arms and stood his ground. This is my property, he snapped. I have every right to defend it against these trespassers. The officer's gaze didn't waver. Sir, this is a public protest on public property. As long as they're peaceful, they have every right to be here. The second officer approached Alicia, his tone respectful. Ms. Brown, can we speak with you? Alicia nodded and stepped forward, her phone still recording. Of course, officer, I'd be happy to provide a statement. The officers took her aside, away from the crowd, and listened as she recounted her experience at the restaurant. Timothy glared at them from a distance, his fists clenching and unclenching as he paced. The officers exchanged a glance as Alicia finished her account. Thank you, Ms. Brown, the first officer said. We'll include this in our report. If you have additional evidence, make sure to provide it to the Human Rights Commission. Alicia nodded. I've already spoken with my attorney. We're pursuing this through every legal channel available. As the officers moved to speak with Timothy, Alicia returned to the crowd. A young woman approached her holding a sign that read, Stand up, speak out. Her voice trembled as she spoke. Thank you for doing this, she said. My mom went through something similar, but she didn't have the strength to fight back. Seeing you stand up means so much. Alicia's chest tightened with emotion, but she managed a small smile. We're all in this together, she said softly. The woman nodded and rejoined the crowd, her sign held high. Alicia turned back toward the restaurant. Through the window, she could see Timothy watching her, his face twisted in a mix of anger and desperation. But this time, she didn't feel small under his gaze. She felt strong, emboldened by the support of the community rallying around her. As the protest continued into the evening, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the determined faces in the crowd. For Alicia, the fight was far from over, but she knew she wasn't fighting alone. The crowd's chant thundered outside the courthouse. Shut it down! Shut it down! Timothy Carter stood in the center of the chaos, his face flushed with anger as he raised his hands in a futile attempt to quiet the protesters. His voice cracked with desperation as he shouted, "You don't understand. She came here looking for trouble. She wanted this to happen." From within the crowd, a young man with a phone yelled back, "She wanted you to insult her, refuse her service, and call the cops. Is that what you're saying?" The challenge hung in the air, cutting through Timothy's bluster like a knife. Timothy's voice rose in volume but faltered in strength. "You don't know what it's like to work your whole life to build something, only to have it destroyed by people who don't even belong here." A collective gasp swept through the protesters. The words hit like a slap, the implication clear and unyielding. "Don't belong here?" a voice shouted, full of disbelief. "What the hell does that mean?" another called out, their anger palpable. Timothy's expression twisted with regret. Realizing too late the weight of what he'd just said, the crowd's chant shifted instantly. "Racist apologize, racist apologize." Their voices were a wave, crashing against him relentlessly. Margaret Carter hurried out of the restaurant, her face pale as she grabbed Timothy's arm. "Tim, stop," she hissed. "You're only making this worse." Timothy yanked his arm free, his glare piercing. "I'm not apologizing to these people. I didn't do anything wrong." The police officers stationed nearby stepped forward, their hands hovering near their belts. One of them raised his voice over the chaos. "Everyone, let's keep this peaceful." The crowd's intensity dipped momentarily, but did not vanish. Their chants continued, simmering with fury. Timothy glared at them one last time before storming back into the restaurant, slamming the door behind him. Margaret followed, her expression a mixture of anger and exhaustion. Inside the restaurant, Timothy leaned against the door, his breathing heavy and labored. "They don't get to ruin me," he muttered, almost to himself. Margaret's voice was soft but laced with disappointment. "You've already done that yourself, Tim." Across town, Rachel Collins's office had become a hive of activity legal files, video evidence, and stacks of notes sprawled across the conference table. Alicia Brown sat at the far end, her laptop open as she reviewed the damning videos of her interaction with Timothy for what felt like the 100th time. Every sneer, every venomous word was burned into her memory. Rachel paced the room, a legal pad in hand, as she laid out their strategy. "These videos are our strongest weapon," she said, glancing at Alicia. "They capture everything. The refusal to serve you, his discriminatory remarks, and even the threats the Human Rights Commission won't be able to ignore this." Alicia nodded, her face set with determination. "What about his finances? You said we subpoenaed his records." Rachel's lips curled into a sharp smile. "We did. They're a mess. The restaurant's been bleeding money for years. This lawsuit could push him over the edge, especially with all the bad press and protests." Alicia's expression hardened. "Good. He needs to feel the consequences of what he's done." Rachel stopped pacing and leaned on the table, her gaze piercing. "We're also bringing in former employees to testify. Several of them have come forward with stories about Timothy's behavior, refusing to hire minorities, using slurs in the kitchen, and fostering a hostile work environment. Their testimonies will show this isn't an isolated incident. It's a pattern." Timothy, meanwhile, sat in his office, fuming. His lawyer, a clean-cut man with a strained expression, tried to reason with him. "Mr. Carter, the evidence against you is overwhelming. I strongly recommend settling before this goes to trial." Timothy slammed his fist on the desk. "Settle? That's admitting I did something wrong. I'm not doing that." The lawyer sighed, his frustration evident. "With all due respect, you did do something wrong. The videos, the witnesses. If this goes to trial, you'll lose. Settling could minimize the damages." Timothy's face darkened. "I don't care about the money. This is about my pride. I'm not backing down." The lawyer hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. I'll prepare for trial. But understand this. The odds are not in your favor." In Rachel's office, two former employees of Carter's Steakhouse shared their experiences. Darren Williams, a young man in his 20s, recounted Timothy's discriminatory practices. "He always treated us differently," Darren said, his voice tinged with frustration. "He never said anything outright, but you could feel it, like we didn't belong there." Another former employee, Jamal, nodded in agreement. "He called me lazy all the time, and when I asked for a raise, he laughed in my face." Rachel jotted down notes, her expression serious. "Your testimonies will be crucial. They'll show a clear pattern of behavior." Jamal hesitated. Do you think he'll come after us for this? Rachel shook her head firmly. You're protected under whistleblower laws. He can't retaliate against you. Alicia offered a reassuring smile. Thank you for coming forward. This isn't just about me. It's about everyone he's ever mistreated. The courtroom was packed when the trial began. Reporters filled the back rows, their pens poised to capture every word. Alicia sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture composed, while Rachel began her opening statement. This case is about accountability, Rachel said, her voice clear and steady. It's about standing up to discrimination and ensuring that those in power are held responsible for their actions. She gestured toward Alicia. My client walked into Carter's steakhouse expecting to be treated like any other customer. Instead, she was met with hostility, humiliation, and outright discrimination. Across the room, Timothy sat stiffly, his lawyer whispering to him. The first witness, Darren, recounted his experiences working at Carter's. His voice trembled slightly but grew steadier as he described Timothy's behavior. He told me to seat black customers out of sight. He used slurs when he thought no one was listening. When Alicia took the stand, her testimony was powerful. She described the pain and humiliation she felt that day. He told me I didn't belong there, she said, her voice strong but emotional. Not because of anything I did, but because of who I am. Timothy's lawyer attempted to discredit her, suggesting she had escalated the situation. Alicia remained unshaken. I recorded the interaction to protect myself, she said firmly, because I knew there would be people like him who would try to twist the truth. As Alicia stepped down from the stand, the weight of her words hung in the air. The jury exchanged glances, their faces thoughtful. The case had become more than a legal battle. It was a reckoning. As Alicia returned to her seat after delivering her testimony, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Her heart pounded as she clasped her trembling hands together. She had spoken her truth, every raw, unflinching detail of her experience. Now the decision was no longer in her hands. Across the room, Timothy Carter sat rigid, his face a storm of frustration and disbelief. His whispered arguments with his lawyer were drowned out by the murmurs of the courtroom. It was clear. The confident facade he had worn for weeks was cracking. The trial resumed the next day with a mix of anticipation and exhaustion settling over the room. Rachel Collins, composed and resolute, rose from her seat to call the next witness, Angela Martin, the journalist whose early coverage had brought the case into the national spotlight, walked to the stand with a poised demeanor. After being sworn in, she adjusted the microphone and met Rachel's gaze, ready to recount what she had witnessed. Miss Martin, Rachel began, her tone professional yet firm. You were present at the protests outside Carter's steakhouse. Can you share what you observed? Angela nodded. The protests were peaceful and organized, she said. People from all walks of life gathered to stand against discrimination, but things escalated when Mr. Carter stormed out of the restaurant, visibly angry. Rachel leaned forward. What did Mr. Carter say? Angela's expression tightened. He shouted accusations, claiming the protesters were destroying his business. Then he said, people like you don't belong here. That phrase sparked outrage. It was unmistakably discriminatory. Rachel let Angela's words linger before continuing. Did Mr. Carter attempt to calm the situation? Not at all, Angela replied. His words and behavior only added fuel to the fire. Rachel presented a video recording to the court, captured by Angela during the protest. The footage showed Timothy's outburst in chilling detail, his tone, his words, and his anger laid bare. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as the jury watched the screen. When Timothy's lawyer cross-examined Angela, he attempted to discredit her, suggesting her reporting might have exaggerated events. Angela held firm, rebutting every attempt to undermine her credibility. What you see in the video, she said firmly, is exactly what happened. The final day of the trial arrived. Charged with the weight of weeks of testimonies and evidence, Rachel's closing argument was a masterclass in precision and emotion. This case is about accountability, she declared, her voice carrying across the room. It's about saying enough is enough to the kind of behavior that has gone unchecked for far too long. Timothy's lawyer countered, casting Timothy as a victim of misunderstanding and overreach. But even his measured tone couldn't soften the damning evidence. Timothy himself sat slumped, his earlier bravado eroded by days of scrutiny and exposure. When the jury finally announced their verdict, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in quiet murmurs of approval. Alicia felt tears well in her eyes as Rachel squeezed her shoulder. Justice had been served. Outside the courthouse, a crowd of supporters cheered as Alicia emerged, the afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the plaza. Reporters pressed forward, but Alicia raised a hand for quiet. This is a victory not just for me, she began, her voice strong. It's for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong, everyone who has faced discrimination and wondered if they'd ever be heard. Today, we've proven that standing up to injustice can make a difference. Meanwhile, Timothy Carter sat alone in his now shuttered restaurant. The empty dining room, once his pride, had become a symbol of his downfall. His business was gone, his reputation irreparably tarnished. Margaret, his wife, stood silently in the doorway, her expression a mixture of disappointment and resignation. You brought this on yourself, Tim, she said softly. And now, You're paying the price. In the weeks that followed, the impact of Alicia's case rippled far beyond the courtroom businesses. Across the community reevaluated their policies, ensuring they complied with anti-discrimination laws. Alicia, now a symbol of resilience and change, was invited to speak at events, her story inspiring countless others to find their voice. One evening, after addressing a packed community center, Alicia stood outside, gazing at the city lights. The fight had been long and grueling, but it had also been transformative. She whispered to herself, "This is just the beginning." Alicia had won more than a court case. She had sparked a movement,